A black couple, James and Amelia Walker, were ready to enjoy a quiet first-class flight after months of hard work. But when they stepped onto the plane, everything changed. A flight attendant, blinded by prejudice, targeted them with subtle acts of disrespect, dismissing their presence and humiliating them in front of others. Just hours later, an announcement revealed their true identities, the owners of the airline. What happened next shocked the passengers and sparked a moment of reckoning no one expected. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and if this story resonates with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. In the heart of an airport terminal, where faces blur and lives intersect briefly yet profoundly, James Walker and his wife, Amelia, moved with a quiet grace. James, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a tailored navy suit, his polished shoes tapping a measured rhythm against the tiled floor. Amelia's dress flowed around her like a whisper, her pearl necklace catching the artificial light. Together, they looked every bit the image of dignity and success, though their skin, a rich and unmistakable brown, often spoke louder than their polished attire. The first sign came at the check-in counter. Karen, the flight attendant manning the desk, offered them a perfunctory greeting, her eyes skipping over them with disinterest. Her tone, clipped and professional, masked an undercurrent of dismissiveness. "Tickets and IDs, please," she said without meeting their gaze, her manicured fingers poised over the keyboard. James handed over their documents with a warm smile. "Good afternoon. We're excited to experience Horizon Air today." Karen glanced at the IDs, her brow twitching ever so slightly as she scanned the names, James and Amelia Walker. They meant nothing to her. Her smile tightened into a mechanical grimace as she printed their boarding passes. "I hope you enjoy the flight. Next time, I'd suggest booking sooner if you want better seats." James's smile faltered. "Actually, these are first-class tickets." Karen's eyes flicked up sharply, her surprise unguarded. She forced a laugh, the kind designed to smooth over discomfort. "Of course, my mistake." She slid the tickets across the counter without apology, already waving the next customer forward. Amelia squeezed James's arm lightly, her silence urging patience. They walked away, their steps measured, their expressions unreadable. Neither spoke of the incident. It wasn't worth it. Not yet, but the seed had been planted. A familiar one. The second sign came at the security checkpoint. The line snaked forward slowly, passengers removing shoes, belts, and laptops with a collective sigh of inconvenience. When James and Amelia reached the front, a stern-faced TSA agent gestured them aside for additional screening. "Random check," he said, though his eyes lingered on their faces just a beat too long. Amelia raised an eyebrow, but James, ever the diplomat, nodded calmly. "Of course, anything we can do to make your job easier." Their carry-ons were open, their toiletries scrutinized. A bottle of lotion drew particular attention, though it fell well within the allowed size. Passengers behind them shifted impatiently, their whispers carrying just far enough to be heard. "Why them?" one woman muttered. "Probably something in their bags," another guessed. When the search was complete and nothing found, the agent waved them through without so much as an apology. Amelia tightened her grip on James's hand as they walked toward the gate. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, but his jaw was set. "I've been worse," he said, "but it's always the same, isn't it?" By the time they reached their gate, the weight of the day had settled between them. Boarding was announced, and James and Amelia joined the line for first-class passengers. Karen reappeared, now stationed at the gate. Her smile returned, but it was the forced, toothy grin of someone playing a part. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice a touch too bright. As James handed her their tickets, Karen glanced at their faces, then back at the tickets, her smile slipping for a fraction of a second. Once on board, the tension crystallized. The first-class cabin was sparsely populated leather seats, complimentary champagne, and a serene quiet that promised luxury. James and Amelia settled into their seats near the window, their movements deliberate. Karen appeared moments later, her voice sweet but sharp-edged. "Can I get you something to drink? Champagne, perhaps?" Amelia looked up, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Water will be fine." Karen smirked, the kind of expression that said, "I expected as much." She turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath. Neither James nor Amelia missed it, though neither said a word. For most, the flight would have seemed ordinary. For James and Amelia, it was a quiet battle, a test of endurance, of grace under pressure. It was in the way Karen lingered over other passengers, chatting warmly, while barely acknowledging them. It was in the double takes from other travelers, their curiosity barely masked. It was in the way small acts, a delayed drink, a forced smile accumulated into something undeniable. The tension simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable. It was the kind of prejudice that didn't shout but whispered, a constant background hum that reminded you of your place in someone else's world. But James and Amelia had learned long ago how to navigate such spaces. They spoke in quiet tones, sharing inside jokes and observations, their love a fortress against the outside world. They had come prepared for the day's challenges, though they knew that patience like love could be tested. As the plane taxied down the runway, Amelia glanced at James, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "They don't know who we are," she said softly. James chuckled, low and steady. "Not yet." And as the plane lifted into the sky, the storm brewing in the first-class cabin hinted at something more than turbulence. The hum of the airplane's engines provided a backdrop of restless calm, the kind that often failed to soothe the tensions of those traveling high above the clouds. James Walker leaned back in his first-class seat, the leather cool against his back, but his body remained taut, like a coiled spring. Amelia, ever composed, sat beside him, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The cabin was sparsely occupied. The murmurs of fellow passengers, the polite chatter of privilege floated around them. But James and Amelia remained quiet. They didn't need to speak. The air around them buzzed with the unsaid. Karen, the flight attendant from the gate, began her service. She moved briskly, her practiced smile softening as she reached each seat. She lingered with a gray-haired couple seated across the aisle, engaging them in small talk about their destination. She poured their champagne with precision, her gestures smooth and deferential. When Karen turned toward James and Amelia, the shift in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her smile faltered, her tone flattened. She carried the same tray of drinks, but her steps seemed heavier, her presence colder. "Can I get you anything?" she asked. Her voice clipped. James glanced at Amelia, their eyes meeting briefly, a shared moment of understanding. "We'll take water, please," he said. Karen nodded, but there was no warmth in her acknowledgement. She returned a moment later, the glasses of water placed before them with an audible clink, louder than it needed to be. "Here you go," she said, before moving on without another word. James stared at the glass, condensation pooling at its base. The slight was small, so small it could have been dismissed entirely. But that was the nature of these things, wasn't it? Small, cumulative moments that piled up like stones in a satchel, weighing down one's spirit over time. Dinner service began shortly after takeoff. Karen and another attendant wheeled the cart through the aisle, offering choices of chicken or vegetarian pasta. Once again, her interactions with the other passengers were jovial, effortless. Her tone grew warmer with every exchange, her laughter a practiced melody. When she reached James and Amelia, her manner cooled like a snap of late autumn air. She sighed audibly before speaking, as if the effort of serving them had sapped her strength. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked. "We'll both have the pasta," Amelia said, her voice polite but firm. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. She handed over the trays without comment, her eyes skating past them as though she'd already moved on. As Karen turned to the next row, Amelia leaned toward James. "You'd think we asked for a 7-course meal," she murmured, her tone low but sharp. James chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Let her keep stacking the bricks," he replied. "Sooner or later, the wall will topple." The meal ended, and Karen began collecting trays. She moved with mechanical efficiency, her smile reappearing briefly as she thanked other passengers. When she reached James and Amelia, she hesitated. "Finished?" she asked, her tone suggesting she hoped they were done so she could move along quickly. Amelia handed over her tray, her expression serene but her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said pointedly. Karen blinked, as if the simple courtesy had unsettled her. She muttered something under her breath, something about manners, and walked away before James could hand her his tray. He placed it on the edge of the seat, letting it sit conspicuously in her absence. The undercurrent of tension rippled outward. The other passengers in the cabin began to notice. A man in a suit glanced at James and Amelia. His brow furrowed slightly as though puzzling over what he'd just witnessed. A woman across the aisle lowered her newspaper, her eyes darting between the couple and the flight attendant. James caught the woman's gaze for a fleeting moment. She looked away quickly, feigning interest in the crossword puzzle on the page. It wasn't guilt he saw in her expression, it was discomfort. The kind of discomfort that came from proximity to something you'd rather not acknowledge. As the plane flew deeper into the night, Karen's presence became more sporadic. She avoided their row entirely during the next round of drink service. Bypassing them without a glance, Amelia let out a small, incredulous laugh. "It's almost impressive," she said. James shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's predictable." Later, when the cabin lights dimmed, James leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He tried to let the rhythm of the plane's engines lull him into sleep. But his mind raced. He thought about his father, who had faced far worse in his lifetime: overt threats, blatant exclusion. He thought about his grandfather, who had been forced to ride at the back of a bus, who had known the taste of humiliation so well it had flavored every word he spoke. And yet, here James was, in first class, on a plane owned by his own company, still carrying the weight of invisible shackles. The chains were lighter now, less visible, but they remained. Amelia broke the silence. "Do you think she knows who we are?" James opened his eyes and turned to her. "I don't think it would matter if she did." Amelia nodded slowly. "Maybe, but it'll matter soon enough." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. James turned his gaze toward the window, watching as the lights of the earth stretched into the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the clouds, was a world they'd fought to build. A world that still resisted their presence in subtle and insidious ways. And in this cabin, at 30,000 feet, the struggle continued, not with fists or shouts, but with glances, tones, and silences that spoke louder than any words. As the plane cruised through the night sky, the tension between them and Karen remained unresolved, a quiet storm gathering strength. But James and Amelia had weathered worse. They knew that even the strongest storms could break, given time and the right kind of pressure. The cabin lights had dimmed, casting the first-class section in a muted glow. Passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight, their conversations dwindling to whispers or disappearing altogether. James Walker, ever observant, noticed how the quiet seemed louder in moments like these, amplifying tensions that others might dismiss as trivial. Karen's absence was conspicuous. She had stopped making rounds in their section. And when another flight attendant, a younger man with an eager smile, came to check on James and Amelia, Karen's avoidance became undeniable. "Can I get you anything, sir, ma'am?" the attendant asked, his tone sincere. Amelia shook her head. "We're fine for now, thank you." The young man smiled, then glanced nervously toward the galley. James caught the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way his posture stiffened slightly before he moved away. He was covering for her. James realized it wasn't unusual. Workers often shielded one another, especially when they sensed trouble brewing. Amelia turned to James. "It's deliberate now." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's always deliberate. That's what makes it effective." Karen reappeared not long after, pushing a cart laden with drinks and snacks. Her movements were brisk, her focus pointedly on the row ahead of theirs. The older couple seated nearby leaned in to accept their refills, laughing softly as Karen handed them 2 glasses of wine with exaggerated cheer. When she reached James and Amelia, her cheer evaporated. Without asking, she set down 2 small packets of peanuts and a bottle of water on their shared tray. "No champagne left," she said, her voice flat. Amelia looked up sharply. "Is that so?" Karen hesitated, her mouth opening as if to argue. But she seemed to think better of it. "I'll check the galley," she mumbled, pushing the cart forward. James leaned back in his seat, the muscles in his jaw working silently. "Let it go," he said under his breath. Amelia turned to him, her voice low but firm. "I let it go at the counter. I let it go at security. I'm not interested in letting it go all the way to our destination." The divide in the cabin was growing palpable. A man in the row ahead, his suit pristine, glanced back at them with a fleeting look of curiosity, maybe even pity. The whispers began again, subtle but insistent, carrying the kind of unspoken judgments that could linger long after the plane had landed. "They don't look like they belong here," a voice murmured from across the aisle. "I wonder what they do," came the reply, the words heavy with presumption. James heard it all but said nothing. He had mastered the art of silence as resistance, knowing that sometimes restraint spoke louder than confrontation. But Amelia, whose patience was as formidable as her wit, was reaching her limit. Dinner trays cleared. The cabin settled into an uneasy stillness. James and Amelia, now deliberately ignored, busied themselves with books and quiet conversation. Karen avoided eye contact whenever she passed, though her presence was a reminder of the tension she had stoked. It wasn't long before she made her next move. As she approached their row, her face bore a faint smirk, one that vanished the moment she spoke. "I'll need to check your tickets," she said abruptly, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. James lowered his book slowly, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me?" Karen shifted on her feet, feigning politeness. "I just need to confirm your seat assignments." "Routine check." Amelia's mouth tightened. "You didn't ask anyone else for their tickets," she said evenly. Karen's eyes narrowed, her professionalism slipping. "I don't need to explain myself," she said curtly. James exhaled deeply, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Then I suggest you don't explain anything at all." Karen's face flushed, but she didn't press further. She turned abruptly and walked away, her steps clipped, her retreat almost triumphant. The murmurs around them grew louder. The passengers were paying attention now, though no one intervened. James caught fragments of their commentary, the speculation, the judgment, the feigned ignorance. "They're overreacting," one voice said. "Maybe there's a reason," another offered. Amelia, watching the reactions, shook her head slowly. "This is the game," she said softly. "Make them the problem. Make us the disruption." James nodded, his gaze steady on the aisle. "It's a game we know how to win." The tipping point came just before the cabin lights dimmed for the night. Karen returned with a tray of drinks, her movements slow, almost hesitant. This time, her hesitation wasn't born of courtesy, it was calculated, deliberate. She stopped at their row, setting down 2 glasses of champagne without a word. Amelia raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I found more in the galley," she said, her tone stiff. "Thought you might like it." Amelia didn't touch the glass. "That's thoughtful," she said, her voice cool. "But the way you've handled yourself tonight suggests this isn't for us, it's for you." Karen's expression faltered, but before she could respond, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent into cruising altitude. Karen turned on her heel and hurried away, leaving the glasses untouched. As the plane hummed through the night sky, James and Amelia sat in silence, the storm beneath the surface still unresolved. The first-class cabin, so meticulously curated to offer comfort, had become a microcosm of something far larger. The other passengers had resumed their quiet conversations, their unease dissipating now that the conflict seemed to have subsided. But for James and Amelia, the quiet was a reminder of the broader challenge they faced not just on this flight, but every day. Amelia broke the silence, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "She doesn't know who we are." James glanced at her, his gaze steady. "She doesn't need to know. It's not about us." Amelia nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the window. "No, but it will be." And with that, the tension in the cabin shifted again, not with resolution, but with the promise of what was to come. The unspoken battle of dignity and prejudice, of power and silence, was far from over. But James and Amelia had spent their lives preparing for moments like these. The night stretched on, the plane slicing through the darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the dawn awaited, though the storm still lingered, heavy and unyielding. The flight had settled into its mid-air rhythm. The lights dimmed, the hum of the engines a steady, lulling drone. Yet for James and Amelia Walker, peace remained elusive. While other passengers sank into their leather seats, masks over their eyes, or headphones blocking out the world, the tension in their row felt sharper than ever, an invisible thread pulling tighter with every passing moment. James sat upright, his book open but unread. His eyes moved over the lines, but his thoughts lingered elsewhere, replaying the evening's events like a reel that refused to stop. Amelia, beside him, was similarly restless, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the armrest. The air between them felt heavy, but it was a weight they knew well. The next encounter wasn't long in coming. Karen returned, her movements hurried but not harried, a mask of professionalism barely concealing her discomfort. She addressed the row behind them first, offering blankets and refreshments with a bright, almost exaggerated warmth. When she reached James and Amelia, her demeanor changed. "Would you like anything else?" she asked flatly, her voice devoid of the kindness she had so freely offered to others. Amelia looked up, her gaze sharp. "We're fine," she replied, her tone clipped but polite. Karen hesitated, as if waiting for something, an objection, a complaint. When none came, she turned on her heel and moved down the aisle, her departure as abrupt as her arrival. The silence that followed was louder than the engines. The other passengers had begun to notice, though most avoided meeting James's or Amelia's gaze. It wasn't just Karen's behavior that hung in the air, it was the collective choice of those around them to remain silent, to watch but never intervene. Across the aisle, a man leaned toward his companion, whispering just loud enough to be heard. "They don't look like troublemakers," he said. His companion shrugged. "Sometimes it's not about what they do. It's how people feel about them." The words weren't meant to be cruel, they were observational, detached, but they stung nonetheless. A reminder of how easily humanity could be reduced to perception rather than truth. Later, during the in-flight snack service, the tension escalated. Karen reappeared, her tray laden with options, fruit plates, small sandwiches, tiny bowls of soup. She moved methodically, offering each passenger a choice and lingering just long enough to exchange pleasantries. When she reached James and Amelia, her tone hardened. "Fruit or sandwich?" she asked. The words clipped. James looked up, his expression calm but unyielding. "The soup, please." Karen hesitated, her brow furrowing. "That's for premium passengers only." Amelia turned sharply, her voice low but firm. "We are premium passengers." Karen blinked, flustered for a moment before recovering. "I'll see what I can do," she said, though the edge in her voice suggested she wouldn't try very hard. She walked away, leaving James and Amelia without an answer. It wasn't about the soup, never about the soup. It was about the subtle indignities, the microaggressions that piled up until they became impossible to ignore. For James and Amelia, this was no isolated incident, it was part of a pattern, a recurring theme in a story they had lived too many times. The culmination came during the announcement of the in-flight survey. A cheerful voice over the intercom encouraged passengers to rate their experience with Horizon Air. Karen walked through the cabin, handing out cards to each row with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When she reached James and Amelia, she hesitated, her fingers brushing the cards but not offering them. For a moment, she seemed to deliberate, her gaze flickering between them and the passengers seated nearby. Then, with a tight smile, she handed the cards over, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Make sure to let us know how we're doing," she said. Amelia accepted the card without a word, her fingers tightening around it. Karen lingered for a moment, as if daring them to respond, before moving on to the next row. James turned to Amelia, his voice quiet but resolute. "They ask us for feedback, but they don't want to hear it." Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. Maybe it's time they did. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, not just between James and Amelia and Karen but in the collective unease of the passengers. The first-class section had become a theater, each interaction a performance of subtle power dynamics that everyone could see but no one dared address. The man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his newspaper forgotten. The older couple 2 rows ahead exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of sympathy and guilt. Even the younger flight attendant, the one who had covered for Karen earlier, seemed to avoid their gaze. His movements hurried as he busied himself with other tasks. But no one said anything. No one intervened. As the cabin lights dimmed further and the hum of the engines deepened, Amelia leaned toward James, her voice barely a whisper. "You think she knows?" James shook his head slowly. "No, but that's not the point. It's not about who we are, it's about who she thinks we're not." Amelia nodded, her expression thoughtful but tinged with frustration. "She's playing a game she doesn't understand, and we're letting her win." James looked at her, his gaze steady. Not for much longer. The night deepened, and the plane sailed forward. In the dim light of the cabin, James and Amelia prepared themselves not for confrontation, but for revelation. The storm beneath the surface had grown too loud to ignore. And soon, it would break. What Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this flight wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a moment of reckoning. A quiet act of resistance that would ripple far beyond the confines of the first-class cabin. The game was changing, and James and Amelia Walker were no strangers to the rules. The plane hummed steadily in the night sky, the gentle turbulence hardly noticeable to most passengers. But for James and Amelia Walker, the turbulence wasn't in the air, it was in the cabin. In the weight of the unspoken and the unseen. The tension had grown thick, layered by interactions that were too deliberate to be coincidence, yet subtle enough to go unchallenged. Karen's avoidance had turned into something sharper. Her veneer of politeness, already brittle, began to crack under the pressure of her own choices. The first-class cabin had become her stage, and every glance, every word, every decision was a performance she no longer controlled. The first sign of escalation came when Karen returned to collect the feedback cards. She moved through the cabin briskly, smiling and thanking passengers as they handed over their surveys. But when she reached James and Amelia, her movements slowed. She extended her hand, her smile strained. "Thank you for your feedback," she said, the words flat and rehearsed. Amelia held onto her card a moment longer than necessary, meeting Karen's gaze. "You're welcome," she said, her tone pointed. Karen faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She took the card and moved on quickly, but not before muttering something under her breath, too low to be clear, but loud enough to sting. James exhaled sharply, his patience fraying. "It's like she's daring us," he said quietly. Amelia leaned back in her seat, her fingers drumming softly against the armrest. "She doesn't know where the line is," she replied, "but she's going to find out." The second sign was less subtle. A few rows ahead, a white couple called for assistance with their overhead luggage. Karen appeared almost instantly, her smile returning as she helped them retrieve their bag. She stayed longer than necessary, chatting with them about their destination and their plans. When she finally turned back toward James and Amelia's row, her expression hardened. She passed by without a word, her body angled deliberately away from them. It was Amelia who broke the silence this time. "She didn't even ask if we needed anything," she said, her voice low but firm. James shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "That's the trick, isn't it? Make it look like good service to everyone else. Make us seem ungrateful if we point it out." Amelia's gaze narrowed. "It's not just her, James. Look around. They all see it." She was right. The other passengers were watching now, their glances fleeting but curious. Some looked away quickly when caught, their discomfort evident. Others pretended not to notice at all, burying themselves in their books or headphones. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at James, then away, his lips pressing into a thin line. The unspoken tension in the cabin was no longer just between the Walkers and Karen, it had spread, infecting the air like an unseen storm. The third sign came during the drink service. Karen returned, her tray of refreshments clinking softly as she moved through the cabin. She served the passengers ahead with her usual exaggerated cheer, lingering just long enough to make them feel special. When she reached James and Amelia, her smile disappeared. She placed 2 plastic cups of water on their tray table without asking, her movements brusque. "Here you go," she said shortly, already turning away. Amelia's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. Karen froze, her back stiffening. She turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes?" Amelia gestured toward the tray. "Is there a reason we weren't offered the same choices as everyone else?" Karen blinked, caught off guard. I assumed water would be fine," she stammered. James's voice joined Amelia's, calm but firm. "You assumed wrong." Karen's face flushed, her mask slipping for just a moment. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. "I'll get you something else," she said, her voice tight. She walked away quickly, her shoulders stiff. The murmurs started again, low but persistent. The other passengers exchanged glances, their unease growing. The man across the aisle leaned toward his companion, whispering something that James couldn't quite make out. Amelia folded her arms across her chest, her expression resolute. "They're uncomfortable," she said, They should be, James replied. The tipping point came when Karen returned, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of champagne. She placed them on the tray table with deliberate care, her smile forced and brittle. "Here you go," she said, her voice saccharine. Amelia didn't touch the glass. "Thank you," she said coolly, her gaze steady on Karen's face. Karen hesitated, her composure cracking. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice defensive. James leaned forward slightly, his tone measured but firm. "The problem isn't the service, Karen, it's the pattern." Karen's face paled. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. Amelia raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but unyielding. "Maybe you don't, but you will." The cabin grew quieter, the tension thick enough to cut. Karen retreated to the galley, her movements hurried and flustered. The passengers around them avoided looking directly at the walkers now, their discomfort palpable. James glanced at Amelia, his voice low but steady. "She's unraveling." Amelia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And everyone else is watching." The unspoken battle had reached its peak, the storm beneath the surface threatening to break. But James and Amelia weren't just passengers on this flight, they were witnesses, participants, and ultimately, agents of change. Karen's behavior was no longer just a personal slight, it was a mirror, reflecting the deeper, systemic truths that everyone in the cabin would have to confront. As the plane continued its journey through the night, James and Amelia prepared themselves for what was to come. The storm was far from over, but they were ready. They always had been. The plane's engines roared softly as it continued its passage through the night sky. But the first-class cabin was anything but calm. The tension had reached a boiling point, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface of polite smiles and lowered gazes. For James and Amelia Walker, it was another reminder that sometimes, the most cutting acts of exclusion were the ones cloaked in civility. Karen had withdrawn to the galley, her absence conspicuous but almost welcome. The remaining flight attendants moved cautiously, avoiding the walkers' row altogether. It wasn't fear that drove them, it was complicity. The silent agreement to let the situation play out without interference. The other passengers, too, had settled into their roles as spectators, their discomfort now tinged with curiosity. Whispers floated through the air like smoke, curling and lingering in the space between judgment and denial. "Do you think they'll say something? They've been quiet so far. They don't look like troublemakers. But you never know." It was during this fragile quiet that Karen returned. She carried herself with an air of forced confidence, her head held high as though willing herself to ignore the weight of the eyes watching her. She approached the walkers' row with deliberate slowness, her expression carefully blank. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, her tone straining for politeness but falling short. Amelia looked up, her gaze sharp but calm. "You've done enough. Thank you." Karen stiffened, her cheeks flushing. "I was just trying to make sure everything is to your satisfaction." James spoke then, his voice low and steady but carrying the weight of suppressed frustration. "If that were true, Karen, you wouldn't have to ask." The words hung in the air, their meaning unmistakable. For a moment, Karen seemed to waver, her carefully constructed mask slipping. Then, as though regaining her footing, she straightened. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice defensive now. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her tone measured but firm. "You do. You just don't want to admit it." The exchange had caught the attention of the entire cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, their gazes darting between Karen and the walkers. The tension was no longer subtle, it was palpable, a living thing that demanded acknowledgement. Karen's composure faltered further, her movements were stiff as she adjusted the tray in her hands, her knuckles whitening as she gripped its edges. "If you're unhappy with the service, I can have someone else assist you," she said, her words clipped. James raised an eyebrow. "And would that solve the problem? Or just move it somewhere else?" The question landed like a stone, and Karen visibly flinched. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned abruptly and walked away, retreating to the galley once more. The silence that followed was deafening. Amelia glanced around the cabin, her eyes sweeping over the other passengers. No one met her gaze. They looked away, suddenly interested in the contents of their books or the in-flight entertainment. "They see it," Amelia said quietly. James nodded. "They've always seen it, but seeing and acting are two different things." The quiet was broken moments later by an announcement over the intercom. The captain's voice, calm and authoritative, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying your flight. I just wanted to let you know that we're fortunate to have some very special guests on board tonight, James and Amelia Walker, the owners of Horizon Air." The cabin seemed to exhale all at once, the weight of collective realization settling over the passengers like a heavy blanket. Heads turned toward the Walkers, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock to something that resembled guilt. Amelia smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well," she said softly, "I guess the secret's out." James chuckled, low and steady. "About time." Karen reappeared moments later, her face pale and her movements hurried. She stopped at the Walker's row, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The confident facade she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by an expression of thinly veiled panic. She began, then faltered. She took a deep breath and started again. "I didn't realize who you were. I want to apologize for." James held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Stop," he said, his tone even but firm. "This isn't about who we are. It's about who you are. And who you decided we were before you even knew our names." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came. The color drained from her face as his words sank in. Amelia leaned back in her seat, her expression calm but unyielding. "We don't need your apology, Karen. What we need is for you to think about how you treat people. Not just us, everyone." Karen nodded quickly, her movements jerky. "I understand. I'll do better." James met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I hope so. Because this isn't just a bad day for you, it's a choice. And choices have consequences." As Karen walked away, the cabin remained eerily quiet. The other passengers seemed to hold their breath, their unease now tinged with something deeper: shame, perhaps, or the realization of their own complicity. Amelia turned to James, her voice soft. "Do you think she'll change?" James shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "She might, but whether she does or doesn't isn't the point." Amelia nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. The battle wasn't about Karen. Not entirely. It was about the system that allowed her behavior to flourish, the silent agreements that made it acceptable. And as the plane continued its journey through the night, James and Amelia knew that this moment, however small, had planted a seed. Whether it would grow into something meaningful was a question only time could answer. But for now, they sat back, their dignity intact, the quiet storm in the cabin finally beginning to settle. The cabin remained steeped in silence, the kind of silence that comes only after an unspoken truth has been unearthed. Passengers avoided looking directly at James and Amelia Walker, though their unease was palpable. Every now and then, someone would steal a glance, quickly returning to their magazines or screens when caught. Karen had disappeared into the galley, her absence conspicuous and her steps unheard. But her shadow lingered. It wasn't just her actions or her words, it was what she represented. She was a vessel for something larger, something systemic, that everyone in the cabin now had to wrestle with, even if they didn't have the language to name it. James leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the armrests, his face calm. But Amelia knew better. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed softly against the leather. For all his composure, he carried the weight of the moment like a stone pressed against his chest. The next challenge arrived not with words, but with actions or the lack thereof. A different flight attendant emerged from the galley, a young man with a bright smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He approached James and Amelia's row, his movements hesitant. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker," he began, his voice careful, "I just wanted to say we're honored to have you on board tonight." Amelia smiled faintly, but her eyes held a sharp edge. "Thank you," she said, her tone cool. The attendant lingered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let me know." James tilted his head slightly, studying the young man. "Is that offer for us? Or for everyone?" The attendant blinked, startled by the question. For everyone, of course," he stammered. James nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good, then just do your job. That'll be enough." The attendant flushed, murmuring an awkward apology before retreating to the galley. The murmurs among the passengers resumed, low but insistent. Words like overreaction and misunderstanding floated through the air. cloaked in the language of plausible deniability. "They're making a big deal out of nothing," someone whispered. "It's not like she said anything that bad," another replied. Amelia's jaw tightened. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. James sighed, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him. "I hear it. I've heard it all my life." Amelia shook her head slowly. "It's not just her, James. It's them. All of them. Sitting there. Watching. Pretending this isn't their fight. It's easier that way," James said. "Easier to pretend that silence isn't a choice." Karen reappeared a few minutes later. Her composure carefully reconstructed, she moved through the cabin with forced efficiency, her eyes avoiding the walkers entirely. When she stopped at the row behind them, she bent low, speaking in hushed tones to an elderly white woman who nodded sympathetically. The woman glanced at James and Amelia, her brow furrowed in disapproval. She leaned toward Karen, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard. "You've been so professional. Some people just like to make a scene." Karen's response was too quiet to catch, but her smile said enough. Amelia stiffened, her hands curling into fists on her lap. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice taut. James nodded, his expression hardening. Every word. The captain's voice broke the tension, crackling over the intercom with an announcement about the flight's progress. But even his calm tone couldn't smooth over the rift that had formed in the cabin. Moments later, the older woman from the row behind leaned forward, her voice loud enough to address the walkers directly. "Excuse me," she began, her tone clipped. "I couldn't help but notice the fuss earlier. I just wanted to say, some of us appreciate how hard the staff works. It's not easy dealing with difficult passengers." Amelia turned slowly, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Is that so?" The woman blinked, clearly not expecting a response. "I just think people should be more understanding. No need to make everything about race." James's voice was quiet but firm. "If it isn't about race, then what is it about?" The woman faltered, her confidence wavering. "Well, I didn't mean anything by it. I just think everyone should get along." Amelia leaned forward, her voice steady but tinged with anger. "Getting along doesn't mean ignoring the problem. It doesn't mean pretending it doesn't exist because it makes you uncomfortable." The woman flushed, her gaze dropping. She muttered something inaudible and turned back to her seat. The final test came not from Karen, but from the passengers themselves. As the plane began its descent, the whispers grew louder, their edges sharper. "I don't understand why they're upset," someone said. "It's not like they were mistreated," another replied. Amelia turned to James, her voice low. "They're not even trying to hide it now." James nodded slowly. "They think this moment belongs to them. But it doesn't. It never did." As the plane touched down, the first-class cabin buzzed with restless energy. Passengers gathered their belongings, their movements hurried, their eyes avoiding the walkers. When the plane finally came to a stop and the passengers began to disembark, James and Amelia remained seated, waiting for the aisle to clear. Karen approached them one last time, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice strained. James looked up at her, his gaze steady. "I hope you've learned something tonight." "Karen." She hesitated, her mask slipping just slightly. I have," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure what that something was. Amelia smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Good, because this isn't just about us. It's about everyone you'll serve after us. Think about that." Karen nodded quickly and walked away. Her steps hurried, her shoulders tense. As James and Amelia rose to leave, the man across the aisle finally spoke, his voice hesitant. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not saying anything earlier." James paused, his expression softening slightly. "It's never too late to start doing the right thing." The man nodded, his face thoughtful, and as the walkers stepped off the plane, the first-class cabin was left in their wake, filled with passengers who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen what they'd seen. For James and Amelia, the battle wasn't over. It never would be. But tonight, they had forced the world, however briefly, to look itself in the mirror. And that, they knew, was worth something. The airport was alive with its usual chaos, voices echoing, the rhythmic click of luggage wheels on tile, announcements cutting through the air like static. Yet for James and Amelia Walker, the clamor of their surroundings faded into the background. As they stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the weight of the flight lingered, heavy and unresolved. Karen had retreated long before the other passengers filed out, her demeanor a tangle of remorse and self-preservation. But her absence didn't erase the echoes of her actions. Nor did it silence the quiet complicity of those who had witnessed everything and said nothing. Amelia adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her movements deliberate. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with tension. James glanced at her, his expression calm but resolute. "That depends on them," he said. Them appeared not long after. A cluster of airline executives, dressed in sharp suits and polished shoes, stood waiting near the VIP lounge. Their faces lit up when they spotted James and Amelia, their polished smiles almost too eager. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker," one of them called, stepping forward with outstretched hands. Amelia tilted her head slightly, her own smile faint. "Ah, the cavalry," she murmured under her breath. James met the man's handshake with a measured grip. "Good evening," he said, his tone neutral. The executive's smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "We hope your flight was comfortable," he said, his words careful. Amelia's gaze sharpened. "Comfortable?" she repeated, her tone making the word an accusation. The executive's smile froze. "Well, yes, I mean, we aim to provide the best experience for all of our passengers, especially you two." James crossed his arms, his stance firm but composed. "Then you have work to do." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear they had anticipated gratitude, perhaps a polite nod to their presence. Instead, they were met with the quiet force of accountability. "We'd like to hear about your experience," one of them said, his voice hesitant. Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Do you really want to hear about it? Or do you want us to tell you what you want to hear?" The question landed heavily, and for a moment, no one spoke. James finally broke the silence. "Your staff needs training," he said, his tone measured, "not just in service, but in respect, not just for us, but for everyone." The lead executive nodded quickly, his expression serious now. "Of course, we'll look into it immediately. We take these matters very seriously." Amelia tilted her head. "Do you? Or are you only serious because we own the airline?" The executive faltered, his polished facade cracking under the weight of her words. The tension escalated when Karen herself appeared in the distance, her steps hesitant as she approached the group. She had changed out of her uniform, her civilian clothes a stark contrast to the professional image she had tried so hard to project on the plane. Her eyes met James's and then Amelia's, and she froze, as though caught in a spotlight. The executives noticed her too, their gazes narrowing. "Karen," one of them said, his voice clipped, "we were just discussing the flight." Karen swallowed hard, her voice trembling when she spoke. "I want to apologize. Again, for everything." Amelia regarded her coolly, her expression unreadable. "Do you know what you're apologizing for?" Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. I was unprofessional. I let my assumptions, my biases, affect how I treated you." James stepped closer, his gaze steady. "And what would you have done if we weren't the owners? If we were just another black couple in first class?" Karen's face reddened, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "I don't know," she admitted. "That's the problem," Amelia said sharply. The crowd around them had grown. Passengers and staff lingered just within earshot, their curiosity piqued by the quiet confrontation unfolding before them. The tension in the air was no longer confined to a single conversation, it had expanded. Drawing everyone in, James turned to the executives, his voice calm but commanding. "This isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about the culture you've created, the culture you've allowed to persist." The lead executive straightened, his jaw tightening. "We'll take immediate action," he said. "Karen's behavior will be addressed, and we'll ensure that our training programs are updated to prevent this from happening again." James nodded slowly. "See that you do, because if it happens again, we won't just be passengers. We'll be your loudest critics." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I really am sorry," she said softly. Amelia sighed, her expression softening just slightly. "Karen, it's not enough to be sorry. You have to be better. Not for us, for yourself. And for the next person who looks like us." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I will. I promise." Amelia studied her for a long moment before turning away. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly. As James and Amelia walked toward the VIP lounge, the murmurs of the crowd followed them. Some voices were critical, others contemplative, but all carried the weight of an uncomfortable truth. The world was watching, and it could no longer look away. Inside the lounge, the tension began to ease, but the memory of the flight remained fresh. James poured himself a glass of water, his movements deliberate, his thoughts heavy. "Do you think anything will change?" Amelia asked, her voice breaking the silence. James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Change is slow, it's messy, but it starts with moments like this." Amelia nodded, her gaze distant. "One moment at a time." James raised his glass in a silent toast. One moment at a time. As they sat together, the world beyond the lounge continued to turn. The challenges they faced weren't new, and they weren't over. But for now, they had taken one step forward, a small but meaningful step in a journey that was far from finished. And as the night deepened, the storm that had followed them began to dissipate, leaving behind the quiet promise of a new day.